Something that Treyarch's Zombies is pretty well known for is how expansive the lore is. Just about everything you see in these games has some sort of explanation or backstory, usually a very morbid one. And of course, that includes all of the different zombie types that you see in each map. So today, as a special Halloween video, I thought it would be fun to explain the dark, twisted, and generally spooky origins of these monsters, utilizing all of the up-to-date lore that may not have been available back in the day, as well as a couple theories of my own to bridge any gaps. This year, we'll be focusing on the ones introduced in World at War and Black Ops 1, starting with the zombies themselves. Well, there are 1,000 ways to make a zombie in this storyline, far too many to cover here, but the one common factor is exposure to element 115. Human or animal, living or dead, with enough element 115, anything will be zombified. But what's always fascinated me about them is what exactly is going on inside their heads. Ordinarily, you would think that they're just mindless beings. But I have a theory that the souls of every infected person still exists within their bodies, fully conscious and with all their senses intact, but with no control over themselves. So they're forced to endure an endless torment as their bodies rot away, until either they lose their minds or someone else comes along and kills them. This theory is mostly inspired by Kevin Sherwood's Easter egg songs, and I actually made a more in-depth video about it a while back if you're interested, but the main reason I wanted to bring it up is because I see no reason that this could not also apply to all the other zombie types that we're about to get into, with a couple exceptions. Hellhounds. The first of the new enemy types to be introduced in Call of Duty Zombies, and the ones with the most well-known backstory. It all started in the midst of World War II, when Dr. Maxis, head of the scientific organization known as Group 935, decided to get a dog for his daughter, Samantha, which she would name Fluffy. At the time, this dog was pregnant, something that Dr. Maxis was well aware of and even warned Samantha about. Though, when asked if they could keep the puppies, he just said, "We'll see," which to me doesn't sound like he was very open to the idea. So it's a little weird that he chose a pregnant dog for his daughter, but nevertheless, it was a nice fatherly gesture. And for a while, things were perfectly normal, until Maxis ran into trouble with his research at Group 935. One of the projects that he was involved in was the creation of teleporters, but after years of testing, he never made any real progress. This made him irritable and impatient, to the point where he took his own daughter's dog to be used as a test subject in one of his trials. He and his assistant, Edward Richtofen, put Fluffy in the test chamber and switched on the machine, at which point she vanished. Maxis was prepared to mark it as another failed test when suddenly Fluffy reappeared in the test chamber, now transformed into the first of the Hellhounds. Naturally, this is when Samantha walked in, looking for her dog, who she saw in the test chamber. Frightened by her new, monstrous appearance, she ran to Fluffy, and Maxis ran in after her. With the two of them inside the test chamber with a dangerous animal, Richtofen saw it as an opportunity to finally eliminate the Maxis family, something he had been plotting for quite some time. He locked the door and flipped on the machine, sending the three of them their separate ways, although none of them were actually killed by the teleporter as Richtofen expected. Fluffy would never be seen again, but she did eventually give birth to those puppies she was expecting, also zombified, which would go on to hunt down Richtofen at the behest of Samantha Maxis. Now, that story is tragic enough as it is, a father betraying his daughter and basically killing her dog, but it gets even worse if you look at the dates from the official timeline. Samantha first received Fluffy, who, remember, was pregnant, on January 11th, 1942. And that fateful teleporter experiment didn't occur until October 13th, 1945, over 3 years later. But the gestation period for dogs is only about 2 months, so there's no way that Fluffy was expecting the same litter during both events. Of course, this could have just been a mistake by Treyarch, but I prefer to think of it as evidence that something much more sinister was going on. Maybe Fluffy always belonged to Group 935, and they were using her to breed more dogs to be used as test subjects in their experiments. And Maxis giving her to Samantha wasn't out of kindness, but convenience. Samantha could take care of the dog, and the dog would keep Samantha entertained so that she wouldn't bother him while he worked. All while Maxis continued to use Fluffy to breed more dogs that the group would experiment on, probably all without Samantha's knowledge. That could explain why she was still pregnant nearly 4 years after they got her, and why Maxis seemed like he never intended to let Samantha keep the puppies. Then, when Fluffy couldn't provide more test subjects as fast as Maxis was going through them, he saw no further use for the dog and took her back to be used in what would become his final teleporter test. Nova 6 crawlers. These are very mysterious creatures. All we really know for sure about them is that they are the result of some failed experiment at Group 935, involving a chemical agent called Nova-6 and pig DNA. This experiment left its subjects heavily disfigured. Their skin turned a sickly pale color, they grew claws in place of their fingers and toes, their faces were replaced with oversized mouths, they excreted a noxious gas, and they were left permanently hunched over, forced to crawl around on all fours. But what exactly was the goal of these experiments? Well, that's unknown. But whatever it was, scientists in America thought it was worthwhile enough to replicate the experiments after World War II. So what could have been so important? Well, the answer to that might lie in their appearance. Nova-6 crawlers bear an awfully close resemblance to the Keepers, and I don't believe that that's a coincidence. Group 935 was definitely aware of the Keepers' existence, and Maxis even communicated with Dr. Monty to some extent. So what if those experiments that created the Nova-6 crawlers were actually an attempt to turn people into Keepers, or angels as they are often referred to in-universe? This could have been used to gain a greater control over the ether and allowed humanity to transcend to a higher form of being. So I could understand why Group 935 and, later, the Americans would want to do this. But ultimately, it was a fruitless endeavor that only left its test subjects tortured and mutilated. But even if it had succeeded, I'm sure that the Keepers wouldn't have been happy about humans forcing their way into their ranks. It was bad enough to mess around with Element 115, so this probably would have led to some kind of retaliation, possibly on a biblical scale. The Pentagon Thief. After Richthofen's attempt to murder the Maxis family, Samantha actually ended up inside the Moon Pyramid device on the moon, granting her power over the ether and ruining Richthofen's plans to take that power for himself. So in order to get her out, they brought Maxis up to the moon so that he could coax his daughter out of the pyramid. But instead of doing that, Maxis instructed her to kill all the people that betrayed them, then took his own life. In turn, Samantha used the MPD to turn the undead against Group 935, killing a majority of the people there. But some of them did manage to survive, and after the war, they would go on to either work in Russia or the United States, where they would be safe from Samantha's wrath. But she was determined to finish the job, so she waited patiently until the opportunity to do so presented itself. Fast forward to the year 1963, where Russia's Ascension Group was doing their own Element 115 research. Working for this organization was a man named Yuri Zavoysky, a brilliant scientist, but not brilliant enough to work on their teleporter known as the Gersh device. After several setbacks caused by Yuri's mistakes, he was transferred to rocket research by his boss, Anton Gersh. Yuri did not take well to this. He didn't think that rockets were worth his time, and he resented Gersh for putting him there. So he continued working on the Gersh device in secret, convinced that he was the only one that saw its true potential. As part of his rogue research, he began reading from Richthofen's diary, which contained all sorts of information about Element 115 that allowed him to finish the device. But it also made him susceptible to Samantha's corruption, giving her the opportunity to infiltrate the Ascension Group and finish off the 935 scientists working there. Yuri began to hear Samantha's voice non-stop, and it drove him mad. Desperate to silence her, Yuri tricked Anton Gersh into a meeting where he would demonstrate his Gersh device. But when the device was activated, Samantha came through the portal, resulting in a zombie outbreak that killed everyone at the site. Anton Gersh was also absorbed into the portal, seemingly killing him, which Yuri initially celebrated. But then, in a cruel final moment of clarity, he realized what a terrible mistake he had made and instantly regretted his decision. However, Samantha wasn't done with him yet. She ordered him to step through the portal, transporting him to the Pentagon in the United States, where he was instructed to release all of the zombies that were being kept there, leading to an outbreak with the intent to kill Edward Richthofen while he was there. Then she sent him one day into the future, where he was supposed to start yet another outbreak at the Pentagon, this time to prevent the formation of Broken Arrow, which was an initiative to wage war against Samantha and her godlike powers. Neither outbreak achieved what it was supposed to, and afterwards Samantha abandoned Yuri, leading to his arrest once all of the zombies were contained. At that point though, he had fully lost his mind, rambling on about the future, angels, Agartha, Primus and Ultimus, stuff like that. Nothing that his interrogators could make any sense of. Eventually, he was transferred to Camp Edward, where he continued to be brutally interrogated by Broken Arrow. During his fourth and final interrogation, they went a little too far with the torture and Yuri Zavoysky passed away. Space monkeys. 13 years after the end of World War II, the Ascension Group discovered that one of Group 935's former test subjects, a man named Pablo Marinas, had survived and was living at the old Siberian facility. Pablo revealed to the Ascension Group that there was a dead elder god laying at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, and if they could bring him some of its blood, then he could use it to assemble the Agarthan device, an artifact with the power to grant any wish. The Ascension Group agreed to retrieve the blood in hopes of using the Agarthan device to win the Cold War. But on their expedition, they discovered that information about the god's corpse had been leaked to the Americans. Concerned that they would use it to gain an advantage over the Soviet Union, the Ascension Group did not take the blood to the Siberian facility like they promised, but instead back to Russia so that they could study it themselves. What they discovered was that monkeys injected with the blood had their strength and regenerative abilities enhanced, making them capable of surviving in extremely hostile environments, such as outer space, which is exactly where they sent these monkeys. But as a side effect from the Apothecon blood transfusions, the monkeys became much more aggressive, which was manageable for the scientists at first, but it became a bigger problem when their spacecrafts came crashing back down to the Cosmodrome, resulting in frenzied monkeys running rampant around the facility. This apparently was such a common occurrence that automated systems were put in place to warn staff whenever it happened. George Romero. Sometime in the early 2000s, movie director George Romero uncovered some old documents detailing the work done by Group 935, which became the inspiration for a movie titled Call of the Dead. In 2011, he brought a crew out to Siberia to film on location at an actual Group 935 facility. All was going according to plan until Ultimus arrived at the site, resulting in Samantha resurrecting all of the bodies frozen in the snow. But George Romero wasn't attacked like everyone else. Instead, he was grabbed by a zombie and taken into the freezing cold water, where he was turned into some other kind of monster. When he came back up to the surface, he had glowing eyes and the urge to consume others like any other zombie, but he was significantly stronger, smarter, and retained the ability to speak in coherent sentences. However, his consciousness was still in there. The influence of Element 115 made him angry and cruel, but he hadn't completely lost his mind like other zombies. It was like he was stuck in some kind of psychological limbo, with his human and zombie personas both vying for control. Stress would allow the corruption to take hold of him, but exposure to cold water would calm him back down. And if enough pain was inflicted, George could fully break free of Element 115's effect, making him fully lucid again. But the tragedy of it was that he was still aware of everything he did under its influence, even if it did all feel like a dream. So, out of shame over his actions, he exiled himself back into the water, where he stayed until the corruption eventually set back in, and he returned to the land to continue the hunt. It was a horrifying cycle of madness and clarity that went on until the Call of the Dead cast was finally killed. But what happened to George Romero afterwards is a mystery. Maybe he continued wandering the tundras of Siberia, or maybe he's just floating around in the freezing cold waters. Whatever the case may be, nobody from that film production was ever seen again. So the two special enemy types from Shangri-la are interesting. As far as I can tell, there is absolutely no lore behind any of them, which normally would be okay since there's plenty that you can infer from their appearances, except that any inferences you could make would be wrong. This is because the location of Shangri-la was retconned. While never explicitly stated, there was a pretty strong implication that the map was originally intended to be set in the Vietnam War, which would make a lot of sense considering it was already featured heavily in the game's campaign and multiplayer, and a lot of the other zombies maps are already based around other events from that time period. So the zombie models were designed to fit into that setting. But nowadays, Shangri-la canonically takes place in the Himalayas, meaning that the visual designs of these zombies don't make sense anymore. Still, I would like to try and piece together the original backstories behind these guys because I think it's kind of interesting. First of all, there's the napalm zombies, who are kinda self-explanatory. They're zombies infused with napalm, a highly flammable gelatinous substance that's most well known for its usage in the Vietnam War. Based on their burnt appearances, it's likely that they were initially killed by napalm strikes, which is an excruciating enough way to go, but afterwards they were reanimated with the chemicals still burning inside them, basically turning them into walking firebombs that seek out survivors and explode, subjecting them to the same terrible fate that they endured. Shrieker zombies, on the other hand, are much more interesting. I believe that they are meant to be Viet Cong soldiers who died out in the jungle. Their clothes, while very worn, do seem to resemble a soldier's uniform, but the main giveaway is these checkered scarves they wear around their heads, which to me look like, and forgive my pronunciation, a Con Ran, a traditional Vietnamese scarf that was often worn by Viet Cong soldiers during the war. But why do these guys run around screaming? Well, I think that's because they're based on the Vietnamese belief that the souls of people who do not receive a proper burial are left to wander the earth in anguish, which was very relevant during the war when there were hundreds of thousands of bodies that were never returned home. Though, in this instance, they take the form of a zombie instead of a spirit. Now, I'm no expert in Vietnamese culture, but as far as I can tell, shrieking really isn't a characteristic of wandering souls. They say that you can communicate with these people on the anniversary of their deaths, but you wouldn't just hear them screaming in the jungle. That seems to come more from Operation Wandering Soul, which was an attempt by the US to exploit this belief by playing tapes of ghostly cries in hopes of demoralizing enemy troops. So overall, these zombies are probably meant to be Viet Cong soldiers whose bodies were lost out in the jungle and never sent home. So they came back as wandering souls whose anguished cries can be heard echoing throughout the area. Overall, I think these are some pretty cool backstories for the Shangri-La special zombies, incorporating real-world history and Vietnamese culture into their designs, assuming of course that my interpretations are correct. But even if they're not, it doesn't really matter because Shangri-La is now set in the Himalayas in the year 1956, pretty far removed from the Vietnam War. Oh yeah, and there are the zombie monkeys too. They were probably just infected by all the element 115 in the area, and I guess it's kinda cool to see its effect on the wildlife, but beyond that, I got nothing. Phasing zombies. Variants of the Nova 6 crawlers. And just like the Nova 6 crawlers, there isn't any definitive information on their origin, but it's safe to assume that they were probably part of the same failed experiments, though from a different trial that granted its subjects the ability to teleport short distances, in addition to all of the other mutations that they received. Now, if my theory is correct about Group 935 trying to create keepers, then the phasing zombies' ability to teleport is probably indicative of a more successful result, since the keepers also possessed this ability. But only slightly more successful. They're still a long ways away from freely traversing the multiverse. Astronaut zombies. After Group 935 was disbanded, all of its resources were split between the Americans and the Russians, with the exception of their lunar base, since nobody was capable of going up there and claiming it. So a space race began, where the winner got access to all of Richthofen's cool stuff on the moon, and basically won the Cold War. The Americans' plan was to create a teleporter capable of sending people to the moon. That is, after all, how Richthofen got there in the first place. But the problem was that Russia's Ascension group was well ahead of America in their teleporter trials, so the Americans rushed to catch up. After only 2 weeks, they started teleporting astronauts up to the moon. If all went according to plan, then these astronauts were supposed to establish radio contact once they arrived, which should have been instantaneous. But that never happened, and everyone they sent up simply vanished. Now, this wasn't because they didn't reach the moon. They did, just not at the right time. They were showing up in the future, some as much as 62 years later, and others probably even further. The process also zombified these unfortunate astronauts, although that was probably for the best. Imagine how terrifying it would have been otherwise. One instant you're standing in the Pentagon surrounded by people you trust, and the next you're stranded on the moon, incapable of contacting the people that sent you there with no way of even knowing that you're in the future. Or worse yet, imagine getting there and seeing the Earth in ruin. Honestly, relatively speaking, these guys had it the easiest. The process was quick, and they didn't have to die a slow, painful, and lonely death on the moon. But those are the backstories of every zombie that we see in World at War and Black Ops 1. As you can see, they all had to endure some type of horror, whether it be cruel scientific experiments, being driven to madness by otherworldly forces, or simply having to face an eternity of suffering. It's dark and macabre, but that's the kind of stuff we love about Call of Duty Zombies. But that is going to go ahead and conclude the first episode of Special Zombie Lore. Thank you everybody for watching this special Halloween video that I wanted to make, and make sure to come back next Halloween where we will cover the ones from Black Ops 2.